Now, overall, we can move on to the post-flop. And the first thing we look at is your pre-flop raises. When you raise pre-flop in position, the main thing we're interested in is button versus big blind. But in general, if we look at the whole picture, I would pay attention first of all to the fact that you only use one sizing. That's very bad. You should consider situations where you can use an overbet, and I can show you those in general. These will be ace-x boards, which are quite specific and powerful. As a general rule, these are indeed situations where you will consistently have the absolute top two sets of cards, and your opponent will, without a doubt, never possess them. Let me quickly find one, and then I will clearly show you exactly what I mean. So here is actually a pretty good example. Ace, Queen, 9. The board is played with an overbet. In general, you always use one sizing. So here with Queen 4 you use a small size, and with Ace King sometimes you can also use a large sizing. Ace Jack, since the BB's range includes Ace Jack suited, then under the top pair it can be more or less the same. So it's worth looking at the overall trend specifically for overbet play. You can also check in GTO Wizard in the flop reports, or you can specifically for 6max look at the flop reports. Here, this is generally well implemented. Or you can buy ready-made pre-flop packs and accordingly later see which overall categories can be played with an overbet. And overall you can see here that these are exactly the categories where you always have two sets and top two pair, while your opponent does not. This specifically concerns playing in position. That is, this is something worth paying attention to, something you should analyze and accordingly draw some conclusions for yourself. Regarding bluff frequency, this specifically relates to sizing. So you always use one sizing, but it's worth diversifying. For example, using different sizings on certain draw-heavy boards. You can generally play calmly using 3/4 sizing at your stakes. This is because quite a lot of draws can be in your opponent's range. Accordingly, you will find that you can value bet much wider in terms of sizing. In other words, you will generate significantly more expected value by consistently using larger sizings, and in the long run, this strategic approach will also add a small but noticeable win rate to your overall profit, to your comprehensive win rate, which, as a direct consequence, will ultimately increase your total profit. As for bluff frequency, the optimal ratio of bluffs to value bets on the flop should ideally be about 67 to 33. On the turn, this ratio shifts to a more balanced 50-50. Now, to be precise, it's 50-50, and on the river it should be around 30 to 70, reflecting a significant change in strategy. But since the player pool is most likely calling a lot, plus there are very few hands to make any kind of subjective sample on the river, we can't really say anything definite here. But overall, I like the flop to turn ratio here. So the only thing I would do here is analyze boards specifically in terms of sizing categories, so as not to stick to just one sizing, to be versatile in order to move up in stakes. Next, the c-bet fold frequency overall is quite good. The only thing is that your c-bet fold on the river is 50, which might be because your c-bet on the river is very high, 62%. And as a result, that leads to frequent folds as well. That is, you don't c-bet the river that often, but again, since the field is passive, you could probably show a bit more aggression. I think you can see this in the lines where you play c-bet on the flop, check, and then bet the river. But for example, here you only have 36%, which overall is very low. And there are enough raises overall, but the sample size is very small. I'll explain why it's low. Because if you're on the SB yourself against, a caller out of position, on the BB against the button, you play check call, check, bet river 54% of the time, and look at how many weak hands you have. Yes, the sample size here is very small. Later on I'll show the full field samples, but here you have a lot of junk that you'll definitely be folding, so pay attention to this. The bet into a check should be higher, and the raise into a check can also be higher. These are the thin lines that for some reason are very often missed, and because of that, the win rate drops a bit. Next. When you play check, check on the flop and fold on the turn 30% of the time. That's generally a good number. A boo at the boards. Overall, there isn't any real garbage in your call range here. So the trash here is probably an exploit, calling with some hands on the rundown, but otherwise I think everything is more or less on point. But the range is calling very weakly, so if there's a reason for this, like to apply pressure later, then okay, but adjusting just for the sake of calling, this situation isn't suitable for a call. If it's a fish, you could try a bluff raise, but for that you need to have equity. You have absolutely no equity and there's no call on the river here either. This is basically calling station behavior, which you need to get rid of. The opponent is using a fairly large sizing and has tight stats, 18-11, and with a low WSF, which overall means you can easily fold the turn and there's no need to make these calls here. So these kinds of calls with ace high or overcards without equity aren't really necessary. These calls are essentially break even. Again, this isn't a call to action, just a recommendation. Next, the turn raise. Here in general, against fish you can do pretty much anything and very often raise their bets. But against a reg, for example, there's very little point in playing through a raise here. You can just fold calmly and wait for a situation that's truly suitable and good. So here, in general, you can also just fold and there's no need to bet. I mean, honestly, I truly don't often see the opposing player or opponent being left completely out of position here, which is quite surprising. Again, just a recommendation. Next, the line. When we play two checks on the flop and then fold on the river, there should very often be raises here. Either a call or a raise should happen very frequently. Because if you look at your exact reverse situation where you're out of position, you have a bet of 46, a check fold of 74, and there's a lot of junk in your betting range. So there aren't that many hands, but overall there's a lot of junk, which means it's easy to push all that out with a raise. So it's also worth paying attention to this situation. Also, regarding multi-way pots, here overall your continuation bets are very good, really solid, but by the way, the c-bet on the flop, check check, and then a bet on the river should be higher. But since you're in position, you can't really influence that here. After a check check on the flop, when everyone checks, so you made an open raise, everyone checked, the bet on the turn should be higher. This is because generally on the flop, everyone tends to show the strength of their hand, and overall multi-way pots are played very linearly. Accordingly, here you can slightly increase your bet on the turn, and this will also give a small boost to your win rate.